I still remember the way my son looked at me when I walked into his engagement party wearing my old brown coat. The same coat his father bought me 30 years ago before cancer took him away.
I can't believe she showed up here like this.
Ethan's smile disappeared the second his wealthy friends noticed me.
Guests, look at this.
Mom,
my mother
he
apparently
said
thought
loudly,
this was a
staring
costume
at my clothes.
party.
You couldn't buy something decent for one night.
Ancient.
A few people laughed.
I know
Then
this is
his
difficult, but I
fiancée
had to
whispered,
tell you.
She looks like she wandered in from the street.
You are marrying
I
your
looked at the
sister.
designer suit wrapped around my son's body, and finally said the words I had buried for years. That's funny, Ethan, considering I'm the one who paid for every suit you own. The entire ballroom went silent. If this story touches your heart, let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place. And please, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I truly love reading every single comment before bed. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this. People look at old women like me and think we appeared that way overnight. They see the wrinkles first, the gray hair, the tired eyes, the old coat that's been stitched too many times at the sleeves. They never stop to wonder how those wrinkles got there, or who those tired hands spent a lifetime protecting. 3 days before Ethan humiliated me at that engagement party in Chicago, I was sitting alone in my little tailoring shop in Dayton, Ohio, hemming a navy blue church dress for a woman named Mrs. Parker. The heater rattled in the corner, fighting against the February cold leaking through the windows. Camila, Mrs. Parker, said gently, while standing on the fitting platform, "You need to charge more for your work." I smiled without looking up from the hemline. "And scare away half my customers?" I asked. "You've been undercharging people for 30 years?" I pinned the fabric carefully. "Most people around here are barely surviving." Mrs. Parker sighed. "And what about you?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I had stopped thinking about myself a very long time ago. The sign outside my store read, "Boyd Alterations and Tailoring." The letters had faded over the years, just like the paint around the windows. But I couldn't bring myself to replace it. Robert had hung that sign himself the summer before Ethan started kindergarten. Back then, life still felt soft around the edges. Back then, my husband was alive. Robert Boyd had been the kind of man who could fix anything with his hands. He worked at a machine plant during the day and helped me in the shop at night. He used to sit near the front window drinking black coffee while I sewed dresses for churchwomen and prom girls. Sometimes he'd look over at me and say, "One day our boy's gonna wear suits nicer than any man in this town," and he was right. I just never imagined those suits would eventually come with shame attached to them. Robert died 17 years ago. Heart failure. Sudden. Cruel. One minute, he was laughing at the dinner table, asking Ethan about his math homework. The next morning, I was standing in a hospital hallway, hearing a doctor apologize while my entire world collapsed beneath my feet. Ethan was only 21 then. Too young to lose his father. Too young to see how terrified I really was. So, I didn't let him see it. I remember sitting alone at the kitchen table 3 nights after the funeral, staring at a pile of bills while Ethan slept upstairs. Mortgage payments, medical debt, college tuition. I had barely $800 left in the bank, but Ethan had just been accepted into one of the best finance programs in Chicago. Robert had dreamed about that moment for years, and I refused to let death steal it from our son. So, I worked. God, I worked. I opened the tailoring shop at 7 every morning and often stayed there until midnight. During prom season, I slept in the back room on a folding cot because going home wasted too much time. I repaired uniforms for factory workers. I altered wedding dresses. I hemmed pants for waitresses who apologized before asking if they could pay next week. Sometimes elderly customers would hand me $5 extra and whisper, "For Ethan's education." Small-town people notice more than you think, especially mothers who are trying not to drown. There were winters when the heating bill got so high, I kept the shop cold and wore gloves while sewing. There were nights I ate crackers for dinner because Ethan needed textbooks. I sold my wedding ring during his second year in college. I told him I misplaced it. The truth is, I sat in a pawn shop parking lot afterward and cried so hard I nearly threw up. But the next morning, Ethan called me sounding happier than I'd heard in months. "Mom," he said excitedly, "I got invited to this networking dinner downtown. Everybody's gonna be dressed up." "That's wonderful, baby. I don't really have the right clothes." I looked down at the empty space on my finger where my ring used to be. Then I smiled into the phone anyway. "We'll figure something out." 3 days later, I mailed him enough money to buy his first real suit. Navy blue, Italian wool. Too expensive for a widow living above a struggling tailoring shop. But when Ethan sent me a photo wearing it, standing proudly in front of some glass building in Chicago, I felt something warm bloom inside my chest. He looked successful. He looked safe. And for one beautiful moment, every sacrifice felt worth it. At first, Ethan called constantly. He'd tell me about his professors, the city lights, the expensive restaurants he could never afford, but dreamed of entering one day. "Mom?" He laughed once people here spend more money on one dinner than we spend on groceries in a month. I remember laughing with him. But little by little, something changed. The calls became shorter, then less frequent. Sometimes he sounded distracted when I talked about home. One evening, I called while he was apparently out with coworkers. Music played loudly in the background. "Hey, Mom," he said quickly. "Did I catch you at a bad time?" No, I'm just busy." I smiled while folding laundry upstairs in my apartment above the shop. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "Yeah, listen, I gotta go. I'll call later." He never did. Another time I tried video calling him on his birthday. He answered for only a second before his expression tightened. "Mom, not now." Behind him, I could see marble walls and men in expensive suits laughing near a bar. "I baked your favorite cake today," I said softly. "That's great." Then his eyes shifted behind me toward the racks of clothing in my shop. And suddenly, he lowered his voice. "I'll talk to you later, okay?" The call ended before I could answer. I sat there staring at my reflection in the black phone screen for a long time afterward. That was the first moment I realized my son had started feeling embarrassed by where he came from. But even then, I defended him. To everyone. To myself. "He's just stressed. He's working hard." Big cities change people a little. That's what mothers do. We explain away the pain because admitting the truth would break our own hearts. A few months later, Ethan got his first major job offer at an investment firm in Chicago. He called, sounding breathless with excitement. "Mom, they picked me." "Oh, Ethan, I'm finally getting somewhere." I closed my eyes and leaned against my sewing table. "I always knew you would." Then he laughed softly and said something that stayed with me longer than he ever realized. "You know, Mom, sometimes I feel like I'm finally becoming the kind of person Dad wanted me to be." I smiled through tears. But after we hung up, I walked over to Robert's old photograph near the register and quietly whispered the words I never said out loud. "No, sweetheart," I said to the picture. "He wanted you to become a good man first." The first time I met Vanessa Harper, she hugged me with one arm and looked at my shoes before she looked into my eyes. That told me everything I needed to know about her. It happened 2 years before the engagement party. Ethan had invited me to Chicago for a weekend, saying he wanted me to finally meet someone important. I still remember standing outside a luxury restaurant downtown, clutching my purse nervously, while snow drifted through the city lights. The valet parked cars that probably cost more than my entire building back in Dayton. When Ethan stepped out of the restaurant to greet me, I barely recognized him. Tailored charcoal coat, perfect haircut, silver watch gleaming beneath the sleeve. Confidence pouring out of him like expensive cologne. For one brief second, pride filled my chest so fully I thought I might cry. "There's my beautiful mom," he said, kissing my cheek quickly. But even then, something felt rehearsed about it, like he was performing affection instead of feeling it. Then Vanessa appeared beside him, tall, elegant, sharp-eyed. She wore cream-colored gloves and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mrs. Boyd," she said politely. "It's so nice to finally meet you. Please," I smiled warmly. "Call me Camila." She nodded, though she never actually did. Dinner felt like sitting inside someone else's life. Crystal glasses, white tablecloths, waiters pouring water every few minutes. I spent half the evening terrified of using the wrong fork. Vanessa talked about ski trips in Aspen and summers in Martha's Vineyard. Ethan laughed beside her, completely comfortable in that world. Too comfortable. At one point, Vanessa asked casually, "So Camila, what exactly do you do in Dayton?" Before I could answer, Ethan jumped in. "My mom owns a small clothing business." Clothing business. Not tailoring shop, not seamstress. Certainly not the tiny store above which I still lived, because sacrificing comfort had paid for his future. I noticed it immediately. That tiny adjustment. That tiny embarrassment. "Oh," Vanessa smiled politely. "That's nice." Then she changed the subject. Later that evening, Ethan walked me back to my hotel. Snow crunched beneath our shoes while taxis rushed past us in yellow blurs. "You didn't have to pay for a hotel," I told him. "I could have stayed at your apartment." He hesitated. "Yeah. Vanessa's staying with me this weekend." I nodded slowly. "That's okay." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "You know how things are here, Mom." I looked up at him. "What does that mean?" He sighed. "Nothing. I want things to go smoothly." That sentence stayed with me all night. I want things to go smoothly, as if I were a problem waiting to happen. Back in Dayton, I tried convincing myself I was imagining the distance growing between us. But mothers know. We always know. The next few years changed Ethan even more. His salary increased. His apartment got bigger. His calls got colder. Whenever I asked about visiting, there was always a reason it wasn't a good time. "We're really busy. There's a work thing happening. Maybe next month." One afternoon, while hemming pants for a local high school teacher, I saw Ethan tagged in photos online. Vanessa had posted them. Champagne parties, luxury rooftops, private yacht dinners, designer stores. Every picture looked like a magazine advertisement for a life I no longer recognized. And there, smiling beside Vanessa in expensive suits I had helped pay for, was my son. The comments underneath made my stomach twist. Power couple, old money energy, Chicago royalty. I stared at those words for a very long time. Old money. If only they knew. The truth was painfully different. Every major step Ethan had taken had been built quietly on my back. The first apartment deposit mine. His MBA tuition gap mine. The networking trips mine. Even the luxury watch he wore in nearly every photo had been bought after I took extra alterations from 3 bridal shops during wedding season. But Ethan never told people any of that. Instead, he slowly rewrote his own history. The moment that hurt me most happened 6 months before the engagement party. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I had called Ethan on a Sunday afternoon while cleaning the shop. He answered accidentally before realizing his Bluetooth was connected somewhere else. I heard voices in the background. Laughter. Glasses clinking. Someone asked him, "So where's your family from originally?" And then Ethan said the words that sliced straight through me. "Oh, it's complicated." I mostly raised myself. I froze. Another voice asked, Your parents still around. My dad passed years ago, and my mom?" He paused briefly. "She's basically just an older relative back in Ohio. An older relative, not mother. Not the woman who nearly worked herself into the grave so he could stand in those rooms pretending he belonged there." I stood there in the empty tailoring shop holding my phone, while my entire chest caved inward. I should have hung up. Instead, I listened. Vanessa laughed softly and added Ethan's worked really hard to separate himself from that environment. That environment. Like my life was some stain he needed to scrub off himself. I ended the call quietly before they realized I was there. Then I walked into the back room and sat on the edge of the old folding cot where I used to sleep during prom season. For the first time in years, I let myself cry over my son. Not because he was successful, because success had started hollowing him out from the inside. A week later, Ethan called me sounding cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Mom, I might be getting promoted. That's wonderful. You should see the people I'm working with now." I swallowed hard. "I'm proud of you, and I meant it. That's the tragic thing about motherhood. Even when your heart is breaking, part of you still wants your child to win." Then came Thanksgiving. Ethan canceled 2 days before. Vanessa's parents invited us to Connecticut. "Oh," I said softly, "we'll celebrate another time." But another time never came. Christmas became a short video call. Birthdays became text messages. And every time I saw a new expensive suit appear in Ethan's online photos, I remembered nights I spent sewing until my fingers cramped so badly I couldn't hold a coffee mug afterward. Still, I kept helping him, because there was one secret Ethan never knew. Years earlier, shortly before his father died, Robert had invested in a small manufacturing company through an old friend. Everyone thought the investment disappeared after the company nearly collapsed. But it didn't. The company eventually exploded in value. Quietly, unexpectedly, and Robert had left every share to me. I never told Ethan, not fully. I only used the money when he needed help building his future. I paid debts anonymously, covered investment losses quietly through lawyers, protected him from failures he never even realized were close enough to destroy him. Not because I wanted control, because I loved him. But somewhere along the way, my protection became his illusion. Ethan started believing he had built everything alone. And maybe that was partly my fault. Maybe I made his path too soft. Maybe I loved him so much that I accidentally raised a man who confused sacrifice with entitlement. Then one rainy evening in February, my phone rang while I was closing the shop. Ethan sounded excited. "Mom," he said, "I proposed." I smiled instantly despite everything. "Oh, sweetheart." She said yes. I closed my eyes. For one fragile moment, all the hurt disappeared. Because no matter what had happened between us, he was still my little boy. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "We're planning an engagement party in Chicago next month. Vanessa really wants it to look elegant." I smiled faintly. "I'd love to come." There was a pause, a long one. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "Yeah, about that mom." Something cold moved quietly through my chest. And suddenly, I knew exactly where this conversation was going. "Yeah, about that mom." The warmth in Ethan's voice disappeared so quickly, it felt like someone opening a window in winter. I stood behind the counter in my tailoring shop phone pressed to my ear while rain tapped softly against the front windows. "What about it?" I asked carefully. There was another pause. Then Ethan exhaled. "It's a really upscale event." I smiled faintly despite myself. I figured, "No, I mean," he hesitated. Vanessa's family is inviting business people, investors, important clients. Something tightened quietly inside my chest. I see. I just don't want anything awkward. The words landed softly, but soft things can still cut deep. I sat down slowly in the chair behind the register. What exactly are you worried about being awkward, Ethan? You know what I mean? No, I said gently. I don't. He sounded frustrated now, like I was forcing him to say something unpleasant. Mom, please don't take this the wrong way. Whenever someone says that they're already preparing to hurt you, I just think maybe you should buy something new for the party. I looked down at my sweater, the sleeves lightly dusted with thread from work. Oh, and maybe? He cleared his throat. Maybe avoid talking too much about the shop or financial struggles growing up. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not just embarrassment, erasure. He didn't simply want me dressed differently, he wanted me rewritten. You don't want them knowing where you came from? I said quietly. That's not fair. Isn't it, Mom, people judge you in my world? I almost laughed at that. People judged you in every world. The difference was whether you sacrificed your soul trying to impress them. I'm not asking for much, Ethan continued. Just one night where things go smoothly. That sentence again. Smoothly. As if I were a stain he needed hidden beneath better lighting. I stared at Robert's photograph sitting near the cash register. My husband's smile still looked warm, even through dusty glass. You know, I said softly, your father used to be proud of this shop. Ethan went silent. He worked in that back room every night after the factory, I continued. He loved this place. Dad also wanted more for me. I swallowed hard. Yes, I whispered, but not at the cost of your heart. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan sighed heavily. So, will you come? Despite everything, my answer came instantly. Of course I'll come. Because mothers are foolish that way. We keep showing up even after love starts humiliating us. After we hung up, I sat alone in the shop, listening to the rain for a very long time. Finally, I stood and locked the front door. Then, I walked upstairs to the small apartment I'd lived in for almost 30 years. Everything inside still carried traces of Robert. His coffee mug, his old radio, the dent in the recliner where he used to sit every evening, reading newspapers, while I mended clothes nearby. Sometimes grief changes shape as the years pass. It stops screaming, starts whispering instead. That night, I opened my closet, searching for something appropriate enough for Ethan's world. But everything hanging there belonged to my real life. Simple church dresses, cardigans, work clothes, nothing that belonged in rooftop parties and champagne photographs. Then my eyes landed on the brown wool coat near the back. Robert's coat. Well, technically mine now. He bought it for me during our 20th anniversary trip to Cincinnati. We couldn't afford it at the time, and I remember scolding him for spending too much money. But Robert just smiled and said, You spend your whole life keeping everyone warm. Let me do the same for you once. I reached out and touched the sleeve carefully. The fabric had aged over the years. The elbows were slightly worn. I'd repaired the inside lining twice myself, but when I held it against my chest, it still smelled faintly like cedar and old memories. I knew Ethan would hate it. That thought alone almost made me put it back. Almost, but then another thought came quietly behind it. Why should I hide the life that built him? The next morning, I was opening the shop when my lawyer called. Camila Richard said I reviewed the accounts again. I locked the front door behind me before answering. And there's still time to separate yourself from Ethan's financial exposure before the engagement. I walked slowly toward the sewing station. I know. Richard lowered his voice carefully. You've protected him for years. But legally speaking, your name is tied to several guarantees connected to his investment partnerships. I'm aware, and if something goes wrong, it won't. You can't know that. I sat down heavily. Richard had been handling my financial affairs for over a decade. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about Robert's investment before he died. The world saw me as a struggling widow with a tiny tailoring shop, and in many ways I was, but quietly, carefully. Robert's forgotten investment had grown into something enormous over the years. Enough to save Ethan repeatedly without him ever knowing. Enough to fund opportunities he believed he earned entirely alone. Enough to quietly clean up mistakes before they destroyed his career. The first time Ethan got into financial trouble during his MBA program, I paid the debt anonymously through Richard. The second time, I helped cover losses tied to a failed startup investment Ethan had foolishly joined with friends. Every time I told myself the same thing, just until he's stable, just until he matures, just until he no longer needs me. But somewhere along the way, helping became hiding, and hiding became enabling. Camila, Richard said, gently pulling me back to the present. You can't keep carrying him forever. My eyes drifted toward a framed photo sitting near the register. Ethan at 24. Graduation day, wearing the first expensive suit I ever bought him. He looked so proud in that picture, so grateful, so different from the man he was becoming. I know, I whispered. Richard hesitated before speaking again. There's another issue. I frowned slightly. What issue? One of Ethan's partners requested confirmation of financial backing last week. Cold spread slowly through my stomach. Did you respond? No, I told them future discussions would require your direct authorization. I closed my eyes. So Ethan had continued leaning on invisible support without even asking me anymore. Not because he needed help, because he assumed it would always be there. Camila, yes. You need to decide how much longer you want to protect him from consequences. Consequences. Funny word. Parents spend years shielding children from them, until eventually the shielding becomes the very thing destroying them. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. Then I stood slowly and walked toward the old storage cabinet in the back room. Inside sat dozens of memory boxes, receipts, photos, birthday cards, and hidden beneath them all, files, bank statements, investment documents, quiet proof that Ethan's polished world rested on sacrifices he barely remembered anymore. I stared at those papers for a long time, then finally closed the cabinet door. Not yet, I thought. I still wasn't ready to expose my son completely, even after everything, especially after everything. 2 days later, I boarded a train to Chicago, carrying one small suitcase and Robert's old coat folded carefully on top. As the Ohio countryside disappeared outside the window, anxiety sat heavier and heavier inside my chest. I kept hearing Ethan's voice repeating in my head. People judge you in my world. Maybe they did. But what hurt most was realizing my son had become one of those people. And deep down, I was beginning to fear that the engagement party wouldn't simply embarrass me. It would change something between us forever. Chicago looked beautiful that night. Cold, bright, untouchable. The kind of city that makes ordinary people feel small if they stand still too long. As the taxi pulled up in front of the Grand Ellison Hotel downtown, I stared up at the massive glass building reflecting gold lights into the dark February sky. Men in tailored coats stepped out of black cars, while women, wrapped in diamonds, disappeared through revolving doors. For a moment, I almost told the driver to take me back to the train station. But then I touched Robert's coat folded neatly across my lap, and I remembered why I came. Not for the wealthy guests, not for Vanessa Harper, not even for the party itself. I came because Ethan was still my son, even if he no longer seemed proud to be mine. "You okay, ma'am?" the driver asked gently. I forced a smile. "Yes, thank you." But my hands were trembling when I stepped out onto the sidewalk. Inside, the hotel lobby glowed with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and soft piano music drifting from somewhere upstairs. Everything smelled expensive. Even the flowers looked wealthy. I suddenly became painfully aware of my coat, of my shoes, of my age. A young hostess checked her tablet when I gave Ethan's name. "Oh, engagement party ballroom level," she said politely. Then her eyes flicked briefly toward my coat before quickly returning to the screen. Not rude, just noticing. That's the thing about embarrassment. Sometimes nobody has to say anything at all. The elevator ride felt endless. By the time the doors opened onto the ballroom floor, my chest already hurt. Laughter poured through the hallway before I even reached the entrance. Rich laughter. Confident laughter. The kind of laughter people have when life has never forced them to choose between groceries and utility bills. I stopped outside the ballroom doors and took one deep breath. Then I walked in. The room sparkled. Huge flower arrangements, gold decorations, champagne towers, a live string quartet near the stage. At the center of it all stood Ethan and Vanessa greeting guests like royalty. And for one brief second, my heart softened. Because, despite everything, my son looked happy. Then Ethan saw me. The change in his face happened instantly. His smile disappeared, his shoulders stiffened, and panic flashed across his eyes so fast, most people would have missed it. But mothers never miss those things. "Mom," he said, walking toward me quickly. Not warmly, urgently. I smiled nervously. "Hi, sweetheart." His eyes dropped immediately to my coat. I watched disappointment spread across his face. Not because I'd done something wrong, because I didn't match the image he wanted tonight. "You wore that?" he asked under his breath. I touched the sleeve lightly. "It was your father's favorite." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Mom," the shame in his voice hit harder than if he'd yelled. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside him holding a champagne glass. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Oh," she said. Just one word, but somehow it carried judgment inside it. "Camila?" she added politely after a second too long. "You made it." I nodded softly. "Congratulations, sweetheart." Her eyes moved slowly over my coat, my hair, my purse, evaluating, calculating. Then she forced another tight smile. "We're doing photos soon." Something inside me began sinking deeper and deeper. A few guests nearby turned toward us curiously. One older man smiled kindly and extended his hand. "Ethan's mother." "Yes, you must be proud." Before I could answer, Ethan laughed awkwardly. "My mom's very old-fashioned," he said quickly. Old-fashioned? Such a harmless word on the surface. But the way he said it sounded almost apologetic, as if he needed to explain me before I embarrassed him further. The man nodded politely and wandered away. Then another woman approached Vanessa, tall, blonde, jewelry glittering at her throat. She looked directly at me and asked, "Oh, are you family?" Ethan answered before I could. "Yeah," he said lightly. "She's from back home. Not my mother. Not Camila. Just from back home." The woman smiled politely but looked confused. I suddenly felt invisible standing right in front of my own son. More guests arrived around us. Conversations blended together. Music floated through the ballroom. And slowly, Ethan started drifting away from me. Every time someone important approached, he subtly repositioned himself farther from where I stood. At one point, I overheard Vanessa whisper quietly beside him. She really couldn't buy anything else. Ethan sighed sharply. I tried, as if loving me had become exhausting work. I walked toward the refreshment table, mostly to escape the humiliation gathering around me. My reflection caught briefly in the mirrored wall behind the champagne glasses. Old coat, gray hair, tired eyes. For the first time in years, I truly saw myself through Ethan's world. And suddenly, I understood exactly why he kept hiding me. A group of younger guests nearby began laughing loudly. One young man glanced toward me and smirked. Whose grandma wandered in. Another woman giggled into her drink. I pretended not to hear. But humiliation has a physical feeling. It burns hot beneath your skin. A few minutes later, Ethan approached again, clearly agitated. "Mom," he muttered quietly. "Can you at least take off the coat?" I stared at him. "It's warm in here." My fingers instinctively tightened around the sleeve. "No." His jaw clenched. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder." I looked around the ballroom. At the flowers, the lights, the designer dresses, then back at my son standing in a suit I once sacrificed pieces of my life to help him afford. "What exactly am I making difficult, Ethan?" I asked softly. He lowered his voice further. "You stand out." There it was, the truth, not hidden anymore. He was ashamed of me. Before I could answer, one of Vanessa's friends approached holding a drink. She looked me up and down openly, then laughed lightly and asked Ethan, "Wait, is she here to help with cleanup or something?" The woman chuckled at her own joke. Vanessa covered her mouth, trying not to smile. And Ethan, "God help me?" Ethan laughed too, not loudly, not cruelly, but enough to break something inside me. Then he said the sentence I would remember for the rest of my life. Maybe she came to clean the ballroom. The group burst into laughter. Real laughter this time. Sharp, humiliating. I stood frozen beneath the chandelier lights while strangers laughed at me and my own son let them. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I thought about every overnight shift, every unpaid bill, every meal skipped, every stitch sewn into the expensive suit now wrapped around Ethan's body. And suddenly, something inside me became very still. Not angry, not emotional, just finished. Then before I could say a word, an older hotel employee carrying folded linens stopped abruptly near the refreshment table. She stared at me in shock. "Camila Boyd," she whispered. I turned toward her. Recognition filled her eyes instantly. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "I can't believe it's you." Her entire expression softened with genuine warmth. And then right there in front of everyone, she stepped forward and hugged me tightly. Ethan looked confused. Vanessa blinked in surprise. The woman pulled back smiling through tears. "You probably don't remember me," she said. "Martha Collins, my daughter's prom dress, 15 years ago." And suddenly I remembered. Single mother. Couldn't afford alterations. Cried in my shop because her daughter wanted to skip prom out of embarrassment. "Oh my goodness," I whispered. "Martha." Martha squeezed my hands. "You saved my little girl that year." The ballroom around us grew strangely quiet. Because unlike the others in that room, Martha Collins looked at me like I mattered. And Ethan was beginning to notice it. The ballroom had gone strangely quiet after Martha hugged me. Not completely silent, but quieter in the way rooms become when people realize they may have misjudged someone important. Martha still held my hands warmly while smiling through tears. "You have no idea what you did for my daughter," she said. "She was so ashamed because we couldn't afford her prom dress alterations. You stayed after closing for 3 nights fixing that dress for free. I smiled softly. Your daughter looked beautiful. She cried when she saw herself in the mirror, Martha whispered. You made her feel worthy. Something painful twisted inside me then, because those were the exact words I wished my own son still knew about me. Around us, several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Vanessa's smile had faded completely now. Ethan stood rigid beside her, jaw, tight eyes darting nervously across the room. He hated attention shifting away from the image he'd built, and for the first time all night, he was losing control of it. Martha finally noticed the tension surrounding us. Oh goodness, she laughed awkwardly. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt the celebration. You're fine, I said gently, but Ethan stepped forward quickly. Martha, right, he said with forced politeness. Thanks for stopping by. The message underneath his tone was obvious. Please leave. Martha's smile faltered slightly. She gave my hand one last squeeze before walking away toward the service hallway. As soon as she disappeared, Ethan turned toward me. Can we talk privately? I looked at him quietly for a moment, then nodded. He guided me toward a quieter corner near the balcony doors overlooking the city. The sounds of music and conversation faded slightly behind us. The moment we were alone, his expression hardened. What was that? I blinked slowly. What was what? All this attention? A hollow laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Attention, I repeated softly. You think I planned this? You know what I mean. No, Ethan, I said calmly. I really don't. He rubbed his forehead aggressively. Tonight is important, and I'm your mother. His eyes flashed with irritation. Mom, please don't do this here. Do what make people uncomfortable. That sentence hit me harder than the jokes, because humiliation from strangers hurts. But disappointment from your own child settles somewhere deeper. I looked out through the glass windows at the Chicago skyline glowing against the night sky. When did you start becoming ashamed of me? I asked quietly. Ethan sighed sharply. This isn't about shame. Then what is it about? You don't understand how this world works. I turned slowly toward him. And what world is that? The professional world. The investment world. Appearances matter. I stared at him for several long seconds. Then my eyes drifted down to the expensive black suit hugging his shoulders perfectly. I recognized every detail of that suit. Not because I'd sewn it, because I'd paid for it. The memory rose instantly inside my mind. 3 years earlier, Ethan had called me sounding panicked. Mom, there's this executive gala next week, so buy a suit. I can't afford the kind I need. How much? When he told me the price, I nearly dropped the phone. It was more money than my monthly mortgage payment back then. But 2 days later, I wired him the money anyway. I picked up extra work for weeks afterward just to recover. And now, here he stood, wearing another version of the same life I'd helped build, while acting embarrassed that I existed. Appearances matter, I repeated softly. They do. I nodded slowly, then finally asked the question that had been burning inside me all night. And what exactly about me embarrasses you so much? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away. That hurt most of all, because he couldn't even deny it. I just wanted tonight to be perfect, he muttered. Something inside me cracked quietly. Perfect. I thought about all the imperfect things that created his life. The unpaid electric bills, the cracked skin on my fingers during winter alterations, the nights I cried alone after mailing him money I couldn't spare. Nothing about survival had ever looked perfect, but it had loved him anyway. Behind us, laughter erupted near the champagne tower. Vanessa stood talking with several wealthy guests while occasionally glancing nervously in our direction. Ethan noticed it too. "She's worried," he said quietly. "About what?" He hesitated. "That people are judging." I looked at him carefully. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "They're judging you." For a moment, anger flashed across his face. Then embarrassment replaced it almost immediately. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Doing this?" As if I were attacking him simply by existing honestly. I straightened slowly inside Robert's old coat. "Do you remember your first internship interview?" I asked calmly. Ethan frowned. "What, the Navy suit?" His expression shifted slightly. "What about it?" "You stood in my shop wearing that suit while I fixed the sleeves because they were too long." My voice stayed soft. "You were so nervous, your hands were shaking." He looked uncomfortable now. "Mom, you asked me if people could tell you weren't rich. Please, stop. And I told you something." He closed his eyes briefly. I continued anyway. "I told you character mattered more than labels." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't the same thing." "No," I asked gently, "because it feels very similar." He looked around nervously, lowering his voice. "You don't understand how hard I worked to build credibility here." Something cold settled inside me then. Hard I worked, not we sacrificed. Not what you gave me, just me. "I understand exactly how hard it was," I said quietly. And suddenly, I was tired. Tired in a way deeper than physical exhaustion. Tired of protecting his ego from the truth. Tired of shrinking myself to preserve his comfort. Tired of pretending his success had appeared from nowhere. I looked directly into my son's eyes. Then finally said the words I'd been holding back for years. "Who do you think paid for those suits, Ethan?" He froze. "What? The first interview suit?" I stepped closer. "The watch on your wrist. Your first apartment deposit? Your MBA expenses when scholarships weren't enough." His face lost color slowly. "Mom? You think these people would be impressed if they knew where your life really came from?" Lower your voice. "No." The word came out calm, firm, final. Nearby conversations began slowing as people noticed the tension. Vanessa started moving toward us carefully. I didn't stop. "Every designer label you wear," I continued quietly, started with my sewing machine. Ethan's breathing grew shallow. "You're making a scene." "No," I said softly. "You made the scene when you laughed at me." Vanessa reached us then. "What's happening?" she asked tightly. Ethan immediately answered. "Nothing," but I looked directly at her. "He's embarrassed because his mother wears old clothes," I said calmly, even though those old clothes paid for his new ones. Vanessa blinked in surprise. "What does that mean?" Ethan stepped forward aggressively now. "Mom, enough." For the first time all night, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, fear of exposure. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. My son hadn't just become ashamed of his past. He had become dependent on hiding it. Several nearby guests were openly listening now. One man whispered something to another. Vanessa looked between us uneasily. Then she asked the question Ethan had spent years avoiding. "Camila," she said slowly, "what exactly are you talking about?" Before I could answer, another voice suddenly spoke behind us. A male voice, calm, older, surprised. "Well," the man said carefully, staring directly at me, "I never expected to see Camila Boyd at a party like this." Ethan turned instantly, and the moment he saw who was standing there, real panic finally appeared on his face. "Daniel," he whispered. Daniel Reeves smiled faintly, while still looking at me in disbelief. And deep in my stomach, I already knew exactly what was about to happen next. Daniel Reeves was the kind of man people noticed immediately. Silver hair, tailored navy tuxedo. The calm confidence that only comes from decades of power and money. Even the conversations nearby seemed to lower automatically when he stepped closer. But what caught my attention wasn't Daniel himself. It was Ethan's face. I had seen my son nervous before. Before exams. Before job interviews. Before his father's funeral. But I had never seen him look afraid. Not like this. Daniel, Ethan repeated quickly, forcing a smile onto his face. I didn't know you were coming tonight. Daniel barely looked at him. His eyes stayed on me with open surprise. Camila Boyd, he said warmly. My God, after all these years. I smiled politely. Hello, Daniel? Vanessa glanced between us immediately. You know each other? Daniel let out a small laugh. Know each other? He looked almost amused. Camilla's one of the smartest investors I've ever met. The silence around us deepened instantly. I saw Ethan's shoulders tense beside me. Vanessa blinked. Investor Daniel nodded casually. Absolutely. Then he turned back toward me. I still tell people about that manufacturing acquisition you spotted before everyone else ignored it. My stomach tightened. I didn't want this conversation happening here. Not like this. Not in front of Ethan. But it was already too late. Several nearby guests had fully stopped pretending not to listen. Vanessa's father, Richard Harper, subtly stepped closer, holding a whiskey glass. Ethan laughed awkwardly. Daniel, maybe we should talk business another time. Daniel frowned slightly, finally noticing the tension. Everything all right? No, Ethan said too quickly. I mean, yes, we're fine. Daniel studied him carefully. Then his eyes moved toward me again. And something shifted in his expression. Understanding. He realized something was wrong. What's going on here? He asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. The ballroom music continued in the background, but around us people were now openly watching. Vanessa folded her arms slowly. You said she owned a tailoring shop? She said to Ethan. I do, I answered calmly. Vanessa looked confused. Then what exactly is he talking about? Ethan stepped closer to Daniel, lowering his voice sharply. Daniel, not tonight. Daniel's eyebrows pulled together. Not tonight, what Ethan's jaw tightened. And in that moment, I realized something painful. My son had never expected these worlds to collide. The wealthy, polished world he created. And the truth standing in front of him wearing an old brown coat. Daniel looked back at me carefully. Camilla, he said slowly. Does Ethan not know? Ethan immediately interrupted. There's nothing to know. But Daniel was already staring at him now. Real confusion crossed his face. You never told him I closed my eyes briefly? Not because I was ashamed. Because I knew exactly what was about to happen to my son's carefully constructed image. And despite everything, part of me still wanted to protect him. Even now. Daniel, I said softly, this really isn't the time. But Ethan suddenly snapped. Tell me what. His voice came out louder than intended. Nearby conversations stopped completely now. Daniel looked between us uncertainly. Then he sighed. Well, he said carefully. I assumed Ethan understood where his early financial backing came from. Vanessa's eyes widened immediately. Financial backing. Ethan stared at Daniel. What are you talking about? Daniel looked genuinely shocked now. Oh. That single word carried dangerous weight, because suddenly he understood the truth. Ethan truly didn't know. Or maybe worse, he had never bothered asking. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. When Ethan joined the firm years ago, he began slowly. There were concerns about certain investment risks. Ethan's face paled. Daniel. But a private guarantor stepped in quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. I could feel the entire room leaning closer without physically moving. Vanessa looked directly at Ethan. You told me you built everything yourself? I did. Daniel frowned slightly. Not entirely. Ethan's eyes flashed with panic. Stop talking. But Daniel was already too confused to stop. Camila protected several major financial exposures tied to Ethan's career growth. Vanessa blinked rapidly. What does that even mean? I finally spoke softly. It means I helped my son. But Daniel shook his head gently. More than helped. His voice lowered thoughtfully. You saved him. Ethan looked like he'd been punched in the chest. Richard Harper stepped closer now, suddenly far more interested in the conversation than before. Daniel continued carefully. The second-year portfolio collapsed during Ethan's MBA program. Ethan froze. That should have destroyed his financial record before his career even started. Vanessa stared at Ethan. You told me that situation was handled by a mentor. Daniel looked confused again. No. Camila covered the losses anonymously through legal channels. The silence afterward felt deafening. I watched Ethan's entire body go rigid, not angry anymore. Terrified. Because for the first time in years, people were seeing the foundation beneath the performance. Vanessa slowly lowered her champagne glass. You lied to me. It wasn't like that. Then, what was it like? Ethan looked toward me desperately now, almost accusingly, as if I were betraying him simply by existing honestly. I hated that look. Because deep down, part of him truly believed I should have stayed invisible forever. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I assumed everyone already knew Camila was the financial guarantor. Richard Harper narrowed his eyes immediately. Guarantor. The businessman inside him had fully awakened now. What level of exposure are we talking about? Ethan answered too quickly. It's handled. But Daniel gave a small, uncertain shrug. Several early investment structures depended heavily on Camila's backing. Vanessa took a slow step away from Ethan. I noticed immediately. So did Ethan. Vanessa, is your mother secretly funding your lifestyle? No. But even his denial sounded weak now. Because technically, yes, at least partially. I watched Ethan's breathing become shallower and shallower. And suddenly, beneath all my hurt, another emotion appeared. Sadness. Deep sadness. Because my son looked less like a successful man now, and more like a frightened little boy watching his fantasy collapse. Daniel glanced toward me apologetically. I truly didn't mean to create problems. You didn't, I said softly. But Ethan suddenly exploded. Why would you tell people this? Every head turned. Daniel looked stunned. Excuse me? You had no right. Daniel's face hardened slightly now. No right, he repeated calmly. Ethan, I thought your mother's role in your financial stability was common knowledge among your inner circle. It wasn't. Well, Daniel said quietly, perhaps it should have been. Vanessa stared at Ethan like she was seeing a stranger. How much of your life came from your mother? Ethan looked furious now. Why does that matter? Vanessa actually laughed once, a cold laugh. Because you spent 3 years pretending you came from old money. Her words sliced through him instantly. Richard Harper stepped forward beside his daughter. Ethan, he said carefully, Were there undisclosed liabilities connected to your accounts? There it was, the real shift. The Harpers no longer sounded like future family. Now they sounded like investigators. Ethan noticed it too. You're overreacting. No, Vanessa said quietly. I think I'm finally reacting correctly. The pain on Ethan's face hit me unexpectedly hard, because no matter how cruel he'd become, watching your child lose everything still hurts. Daniel turned toward me again, softer this time. Camila, he said quietly, you should have gotten credit years ago. I smiled sadly. I never wanted credit, and that was the truth. I didn't help Ethan because I wanted praise. I helped him because I loved him. But somewhere along the way, love without accountability had turned dangerous. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So let me understand this clearly, she said coldly. Your mother funded the image you've been selling everyone? Ethan's silence answered for him. And in that silence, I watched the first real crack appear in the life he had spent years building. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed completely after that. Not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly, like ice cracking beneath people's feet. The music still played, champagne still flowed. But nobody was celebrating anymore. People were watching. Watching Ethan, watching Vanessa, watching me, and suddenly my old brown coat no longer looked like the most embarrassing thing in the room. Vanessa stepped farther away from Ethan, her expression tight with disbelief. So all this time, she said slowly, your mother was funding your image. Ethan looked exhausted now. It wasn't like that. That's exactly what it looks like. No, he snapped. I worked for everything I have. You had help, Daniel Reeves corrected gently. Ethan turned toward him angrily. Why are you still talking? Daniel's face hardened slightly. Because you're acting ashamed of the woman who protected your career. The words hit harder than Daniel probably intended. I watched Ethan's face twist between anger and humiliation. But what hurt me most was this. At no point had my son looked at me and simply said, thank you. Not once. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. You told me your success came from discipline, she said coldly. It did. You said you came from nothing. I practically did. I finally spoke quietly. No, Ethan. You came from sacrifice. The room fell silent again. Ethan looked at me like my words physically hurt him. Maybe they did, because sacrifice sounds beautiful when it's anonymous. But when people are forced to acknowledge it publicly, it becomes uncomfortable, especially for those who benefited most from it. Vanessa laughed softly then, but there was no warmth in it. This is unbelievable. Ethan stepped closer to her. Vanessa, please? She moved away immediately. No, don't please me right now. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes had gone cold. You spent years making it sound like your family had some quiet legacy wealth situation. I never said that. You absolutely implied it. Richard Harper joined them now, his expression unreadable. He looked more like a businessman evaluating risk than a future father-in-law. Ethan, he said carefully, I think perhaps we should discuss the extent of these financial arrangements privately. The phrasing alone told me everything. Financial arrangements, not family, not support, liabilities. Ethan noticed it too. His face tightened. There's nothing to discuss. Richard's voice remained calm. Daniel mentioned guarantees tied to your investment structures. They're under control. Are they? That single question sliced through Ethan's confidence instantly. Vanessa turned toward me suddenly. How much money are we actually talking about? I stared at her quietly. Not because I didn't know the answer, because the question itself revealed everything about her. Not Did you suffer? Not how long did you help him? Not why would a mother sacrifice so much? Just how much I smiled sadly. Enough. Vanessa frowned impatiently. That's not an answer. No, I said softly. It's the only answer you need. She looked frustrated by my calmness. For years, people like Vanessa had mistaken softness for weakness. But surviving hardship quietly gives older women a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't need to shout. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face now. Can we stop doing this here? I looked at him carefully. Doing what? This public humiliation. The irony nearly took my breath away. Public humiliation, as if I hadn't spent the last hour standing in it myself. I tilted my head slightly. Did you feel humiliated when your friends laughed at me? His silence answered loudly enough. Vanessa looked disturbed now. You really said she looked like she came to clean the ballroom. One of her friends nearby suddenly became very interested in her drink. Nobody wanted ownership of the cruelty anymore now that the room had shifted. Ethan exhaled sharply. I was joking. No, I whispered. You were revealing yourself. That landed. I saw it in his eyes immediately. Pain. Real pain this time, because somewhere beneath all the arrogance and pretending, a part of Ethan still knew exactly who he had become, and he hated being forced to look at it. Daniel glanced at me quietly. Camila, he said gently, would you like me to arrange a car home? The kindness in his voice nearly broke me, because after everything tonight, a stranger was protecting my dignity more carefully than my own child. Before I could answer, Vanessa suddenly spoke again. So what exactly does Ethan even own himself? Vanessa Ethan warned. No, I'd really like to know. Her voice sharpened now. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like your entire lifestyle was subsidized. The word subsidized hit Ethan like a slap. Stop talking about me like I'm some fraud, Richard Harper finally sighed. Ethan, nobody's calling you a fraud. But his expression suggested otherwise, and Ethan noticed. That was the tragic thing about wealthy circles. The moment weakness appears, respect disappears faster than smoke. I watched panic slowly settle deeper into my son's face. Not because he'd hurt me, because his image was collapsing. Vanessa shook her head slowly. I defended you to my parents for years. Ethan stared at her. What's that supposed to mean? It means they thought you tried too hard. His face darkened. And what did you think? She hesitated just long enough to answer honestly. I thought you were ambitious. The room went painfully quiet again. Then she added softly, but now, I think you were performing. That one sentence shattered something inside him. I saw it happen. Ethan looked suddenly smaller standing there in his expensive suit, like a man realizing the world he fought so desperately to enter had never truly loved him either. Only the version of him that looked polished enough. I should have felt satisfied. Part of me expected anger after years of emotional distance, but instead, I just felt tired. Tired of watching people measure human worth through money labels and appearances. Tired of watching my son chase approval from people who would abandon him the second his image cracked. Because deep down, I already knew Vanessa Harper didn't love Ethan. Not really. She loved what standing beside him said about herself. And now that image was cracking too. Vanessa looked toward me again. Did you ever plan on telling him the truth? I answered honestly. No. Ethan looked stunned by that. Why not? I finally turned fully toward him. Because I wanted you to become successful without feeling indebted to me. His expression shifted slightly. Pain flickered there again. But somewhere along the way I continued quietly. You stopped being grateful and started being ashamed. The words landed harder than anything else tonight. Ethan swallowed visibly. For the first time since I arrived, he looked directly into my eyes. Really looked. And I think he finally saw it then. Not embarrassment. Not inconvenience. Not an old woman ruining his perfect evening. Just his mother. Tired. Hurt. Heartbroken. The woman who had spent half her life making sure he never felt poor. Vanessa suddenly exhaled sharply and picked up her purse. I need air. Vanessa, no. She shook her head firmly. I can't do this right now. Then she looked directly at Ethan and said the sentence that changed the entire night. I don't even know who you are anymore. And with that, she walked away. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just coldly, like someone stepping away from a bad investment before it lost more value. Ethan stared after her in stunned silence. And for the first time all evening, my son looked completely alone. After Vanessa walked out of the ballroom, the engagement party died without anyone officially ending it. People tried pretending otherwise. The band kept playing softly. Waiters continued carrying champagne trays. Guests forced awkward conversations near the dessert tables. But the illusion was broken, and everyone knew it. I stood near the balcony doors while Ethan stared toward the hallway Vanessa had disappeared down. His face looked pale beneath the ballroom lights. For the first time in years, my son no longer looked powerful, just lost. Richard Harper approached him quietly. We'll discuss this later, he said in a controlled voice. Then he walked away without shaking Ethan's hand. That small detail hurt Ethan more than yelling would have. In wealthy circles, rejection often arrives politely. That's what makes it cruel. Daniel Reeves gave me a sympathetic look before leaving as well. Call me if you need anything, he said softly. I nodded gratefully. Then suddenly, it was just me and Ethan standing there in the middle of a room full of people pretending not to watch us. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. You should go. I stared at him. Not angry anymore, just tired. You're still worried about appearances? I asked quietly. His eyes flashed briefly with frustration. You don't understand what tonight cost me. And there it was again. Me. My embarrassment, my humiliation, my sacrifices, all somehow transformed into damage done to him. I picked up my purse slowly. No, I whispered. I understand exactly what it cost. Then I walked away. Ethan didn't stop me. That hurt more than anything else. Outside, freezing wind cut through downtown Chicago, while taxis splashed through wet streets. I stood beneath the hotel awning for several minutes, trying to steady myself emotionally. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. But mostly, I just felt empty. An older doorman noticed me struggling with my suitcase. Would you like me to call a car, ma'am? Yes, please. While waiting, I pulled Robert's coat tighter around myself and stared at the city lights. I remembered Ethan at 7 years old, running into my tailoring shop after school with scraped knees and missing front teeth. Back then, if someone hurt my feelings, he'd get angry on my behalf. Once, when a customer rudely mocked my accent, Ethan stood in front of me and shouted, "Don't talk to my mom like that." He had been so small, so protective, so proud of me. I wondered where that little boy had gone. The next morning, I woke up in my hotel room feeling exhausted in my bones. Not physically, emotionally. I considered taking an early train back to Dayton immediately, But before I could even finish coffee, my phone rang. Richard, my lawyer, Camila. He said carefully. I heard what happened last night. I sighed softly. News travels fast. In Chicago, finance circles faster than wildfire. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. I suppose Ethan's thrilled about that? Richard hesitated. Actually, there's something more important. My stomach tightened instantly. What is it? One of the firms connected to Ethan's investment group requested immediate confirmation of your guarantees this morning. I closed my eyes. Of course they had, because once wealthy people smell instability, they rush to protect themselves. What exactly are they asking? They want reassurance. Your backing remains active. The room suddenly felt colder. I walked toward the window overlooking downtown Chicago. Below me, people hurried through crosswalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that my son's carefully constructed life was beginning to crack open. Camila Richard continued carefully. You need to make a decision. I already knew what decision he meant. For years, nearly every major financial risk tied to Ethan's career had quietly rested beneath my protection. Not publicly, not visibly, but legally. Silently. I had signed documents Ethan never bothered reading closely because he trusted the support would always exist. And until now, it had. I leaned my forehead briefly against the cold glass window. What happens if I withdraw everything? Richard paused. The immediate effects could be significant. How significant certain accounts may freeze pending review. Credit extensions could disappear. Some property agreements may be reconsidered. I closed my eyes again. The luxury apartment, the leased car, investment access. Pieces of Ethan's world suddenly looked far less stable than he imagined. And for the first time, I had to ask myself a question I'd avoided for years. Was I helping my son anymore? Or simply protecting him from becoming accountable? Richard lowered his voice gently. You've spent years cushioning every fall. I know. But eventually, a man either learns responsibility or he mistakes protection for entitlement. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Because deep down, I knew Richard was right. I had loved Ethan so fiercely that I kept removing consequences before they could reach him. And maybe that's why he grew into a man who believed comfort simply appeared. A man who wore expensive suits without remembering the exhausted woman behind the sewing machine. Camila. Yes. What would Robert want you to do? That question shattered me. I looked down at the old coat draped across the chair nearby. Robert would have protected Ethan too. But Robert also believed character mattered more than appearances. And somewhere along the way, our son had forgotten that completely. I want the guarantees withdrawn, I whispered. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Are you sure? No, I wasn't sure. Not emotionally. No mother enjoys watching her child fall, even when he deserves the lesson. Especially then. But slowly, painfully, I answered anyway. Yes. Richard spoke gently now. I'll begin the process today. After the call ended, I sat motionless for nearly 20 minutes. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, from grief, because this didn't feel like punishing my son. It felt like finally stopping myself from carrying him. Around noon, my phone rang again. Ethan. I stared at his name for several seconds before answering. What? No greeting, no apology, just one sharp word. My chest tightened immediately. Hello to you too, I said quietly. Did you pull your backing from my accounts straight to it? Not Mom, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry about last night. Just money. I closed my eyes slowly. Yes. The silence afterward felt dangerous. Then Ethan exploded. What the hell were you thinking? I flinched slightly at the anger in his voice. I was thinking it's time you stand on your own. You can't do this to me. A painful laugh escaped me before I could stop it. To you, my accounts are frozen. I stayed silent, my credit lines under review, still silent. They're questioning property agreements now. There it was. The fear, real fear this time. Not about love, not about family, about losing the lifestyle. Mom, Ethan said sharply, fix this. That sentence finally did something inside me. It broke the last fragile thread holding my guilt together. Because even now, after humiliating me publicly, after hiding me for years, after treating my sacrifices like inconveniences, he still believed my role was to clean up the damage, fix this. Like I was still standing behind a sewing machine repairing holes he created. I inhaled slowly, then finally answered in the calmest voice I had used all day. Ethan, I said quietly, I already spent half my life fixing things for you. Silence. Heavy, breathing silence. Then I added softly, and somewhere along the way, you stopped noticing what it cost me. 3 days after I returned to Dayton, Ohio, Ethan showed up at my tailoring shop unannounced. I knew it was him before I even opened the door. Not because I saw him, because expensive cars sound different in small towns. The black luxury SUV parked outside my faded storefront looked almost ridiculous beside the cracked sidewalks and old brick buildings downtown. I was pinning the hem of a waitress uniform when the engine shut off outside. For a second, my hands froze. Then I kept working. The bell above the shop door rang moments later. Ethan stepped inside wearing another designer coat, though this time it looked wrinkled, rushed, almost careless. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His jaw looked tense enough to crack. The moment he entered, he glanced around the shop like he suddenly remembered where he actually came from. The old wooden floors, the sewing machines, the faded family photos near the register, the smell of fabric steam and detergent. This place had built him, and he'd spent years pretending it didn't exist. Mom, I kept pinning fabric calmly. Good morning, Ethan. That's it. I looked up slowly. What else would you like me to say? His frustration flared instantly. My accounts are still frozen. I sighed softly. There it was again. Not, I'm sorry. Not, how are you? Just damage control. Mrs. Jenkins, the waitress whose uniform I was hemming, glanced nervously between us. I smiled gently at her. Your order will be ready tomorrow. She nodded quickly, sensing tension immediately. Once she left, silence swallowed the shop. Ethan shoved both hands through his hair aggressively. You really did this? Yes. Do you understand what's happening right now? I folded the uniform carefully before answering. I think for the first time in your life, you do. His face hardened. You're punishing me. No, I said quietly. Consequences are not punishment. That's easy for you to say. I looked around the tiny tailoring shop slowly. The cracked walls, the ancient heater, the overused sewing machines, then back at my son standing there in clothes worth more than my monthly expenses. Yes, I whispered. Life's been very easy for me. The sarcasm landed immediately. Ethan looked away first. Good. Let him feel uncomfortable. I had lived inside discomfort for years while protecting his pride. You embarrassed me in front of everyone, he muttered. The words actually stunned me. I stared at him for several seconds, honestly speechless. Then I laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes pain becomes too absurd for tears. I embarrassed you, I repeated softly. You exposed private financial matters publicly. I walked slowly around the counter. No, Ethan, I said calmly. You humiliated me publicly. The truth simply showed up afterward. His jaw tightened again. You could have handled things differently. So could you. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind families carry when years of unspoken resentment finally surface. Outside, snow drifted lightly across the street while an old pickup truck rolled past the storefront. Inside, my son looked like a stranger wearing expensive shoes on the same floors where he once played with toy cars after school. I lost Vanessa, he said suddenly. Something inside me softened despite everything, because pain is still pain when it belongs to your child. But before I could respond, Ethan added bitterly, her parents think I manipulated them. I closed my eyes briefly. Still no acknowledgement of what he'd done to me. Only what he'd lost himself. They liked the version of you that looked successful, I said quietly. That's not fair. No, I whispered. Fair would have been remembering who loved you before success. He looked exhausted now. Anger still burned beneath his expression, but fear had started replacing confidence. Real fear. The kind money can't instantly fix. My firm's reviewing everything, he admitted quietly. I nodded once. They should. His eyes flashed. You really want to see me fail? That question hurt more than I expected. Because despite everything, I still didn't. No mother wants that, I said softly. Then why are you doing this? I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because I think I already failed once. Confusion crossed his face. What does that mean? It means I spent so many years protecting you from hardship? My voice shook slightly now. That I accidentally raised a man who mistakes sacrifice for entitlement. That hit him hard. I saw it immediately. He looked away. Good, let him sit inside those words. The silence stretched until finally Ethan muttered, You think I'm some spoiled monster now? I smiled sadly. No, I whispered. I think you forgot how to see people clearly. His eyes finally met mine again. And for the first time in years, I saw shame there. Real shame. Not embarrassment about appearances, not fear about money. Actual shame. He looked around the shop slowly. I used to hate this place, he admitted quietly. That surprised me. I leaned against the counter. Why? Because I knew what people thought of it. What did they think? That we were poor? I almost laughed again. We were poor. Just not in the ways Ethan now understood. I remember kids making comments about your clothes. He continued, about Dad's old truck. His voice sounded younger suddenly, smaller. I hated it. A deep ache moved through my chest. Because suddenly, I saw something I'd missed all these years. Part of Ethan's obsession with status hadn't started in Chicago. It started here, in childhood shame, in wanting desperately to escape feeling less than everyone else. I didn't know you carried that, I said softly. He shrugged bitterly. What difference would it have made? Maybe none. Maybe everything. Parents can love their children completely and still miss pieces of them. That realization hurts too. But you know what's funny? Ethan continued quietly. Back then, I promised myself if I ever became successful, nobody would ever look down on us again. I swallowed hard, and instead, I whispered, You started looking down on us first. His face tightened immediately, because he knew it was true. Tears suddenly burned behind my eyes. Not because of the money, not because of the party, because I could finally see the broken road that led my son here. fear, shame, desperation to belong. The problem was, he became so obsessed with escaping humiliation that he started humiliating others before they could do it to him, including me. I walked slowly toward the old storage cabinet in the back room. Ethan frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" I opened the cabinet carefully and pulled out a small, faded cardboard box. Dust covered the edges. His expression shifted immediately. "What's that?" I carried it back slowly, then placed it on the counter between us. "Your father kept these for you." Ethan stared at the box silently. Inside sat dozens of old letters, birthday cards, and photographs tied neatly with faded ribbon. He looked suddenly nervous. "I've never seen that before." "I know. Why not? Because after your father died." My voice caught slightly. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Carefully, I lifted one envelope from the top. Robert's handwriting covered the front. "For Ethan, when you become the man you're meant to be." Ethan's face changed instantly. All the anger drained away. I handed him the letter quietly. His fingers trembled taking it. For several seconds, he simply stared at his father's handwriting without moving. Then finally, very softly, he asked, "When did Dad write this?" I looked toward Robert's old photograph near the register. "The week before, he died." And suddenly, for the first time since walking into my shop, my son looked afraid of something that had nothing to do with money. Ethan stared at the envelope in his hands like it might explode. The tailoring shop had gone completely silent, except for the faint hum of the old heater near the window. Outside, snow drifted lazily through downtown Dayton. Inside, my son looked 10 years younger. Smaller somehow, more fragile. "Dad wrote this for me?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. He knew his heart was failing before he told us. Ethan swallowed hard. "He never told me. He didn't want you afraid." For several seconds, Ethan simply stood there staring at Robert's handwriting. Then slowly, almost carefully, he opened the envelope. I turned away to give him privacy. Not because I didn't already know what the letter said. Because I remembered the night Robert wrote it. He sat at our kitchen table after midnight, coughing quietly while I stitched a church dress nearby. Every few minutes, he stopped writing to press his hand against his chest when the pain worsened. I remember asking him, "Shouldn't you be resting?" And he smiled at me softly. I need to leave him something that matters. Back then, I thought he meant advice. Now I understood better. Robert wasn't writing instructions for success. He was trying to leave Ethan a moral compass. Something steady after he was gone. Behind me, paper trembled softly in Ethan's hands as he read. Then finally, I heard his breathing hitch. My eyes closed immediately, because no matter how old your child becomes, hearing them cry still breaks you apart. I stayed quiet while he kept reading. Several minutes passed before Ethan spoke again. His voice sounded cracked. He knew I turned slowly, knew that things would get hard for you. Tears ran openly down Ethan's face now, though he didn't seem to notice. I leaned gently against the sewing table. "Your father knew me well." Ethan stared back down at the letter. "I never knew he wrote this." "No. Why didn't you give it to me sooner?" I thought about that carefully before answering. "Because I kept waiting for the right version of you to come back." That hurt him. I saw it instantly. But it was the truth. Ethan lowered himself slowly into one of the old wooden chairs near the fitting mirror. His expensive coat hung awkwardly around him now, like it no longer fit properly. "What else did Dad say?" he whispered. I hesitated, then quietly answered, "He asked you to protect my heart after he was gone." The tears came harder after that. Ethan covered his mouth with one shaking hand while staring at the paper. I failed him. The words barely came out. I wanted to comfort him. God help me, I wanted to. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Even after your child hurts you deeply, some part of your heart still rushes toward their pain, automatically. But I stayed where I was, because Ethan needed truth now more than comfort. He also wrote something else, I said softly. Ethan looked up slowly. He said success means nothing if it costs you kindness. The silence afterward felt sacred somehow, like Robert himself had stepped briefly back into the room. Finally, Ethan looked around the tailoring shop again. But this time, his eyes lingered differently. Not with embarrassment. With memory. I used to sit over there after school, he said quietly, pointing toward the corner near the fabric shelves. I smiled faintly. You'd complain about homework while your father pretended to understand algebra. A weak laugh escaped Ethan unexpectedly. Dad was terrible at math. Awful. For one tiny moment, something warm returned between us. Not healing, not forgiveness, just memory. Then Ethan's phone rang violently against the counter. The sound shattered everything. He glanced at the screen immediately, and panic crossed his face. Who is it? I asked. He ignored the question and answered quickly. Hello. I watched his expression collapse almost immediately. No, that's impossible. Silence. Then they can't do that. Another pause. His face turned pale. I understand. Slowly, Ethan lowered the phone from his ear. My stomach tightened. What happened? He stared at the floor for several seconds before answering. The firm suspended me. The words landed heavily between us. Not fired, not yet, but close enough to taste. I inhaled quietly. Why they're reviewing my financial disclosures? I frowned slightly. What does that mean? Ethan laughed bitterly. It means people started asking questions after the engagement party. His voice hardened now. They think I misrepresented parts of my financial background. I crossed my arms slowly. Did you know? But he answered too fast, too defensively, and we both knew it. He sat heavily back into the chair, exhausted. My boss said some investors are nervous now. About what that I depended too heavily on external financial support. I stayed quiet because the truth was uncomfortable. He had. Ethan rubbed his face aggressively. This whole thing is spiraling. Then suddenly, he looked up at me. You told them, didn't you? The accusation stunned me. What you told the firm about the guarantees. No. Then how would they know? Anger flashed briefly through me. Not everything bad that happens to you is my doing. But Ethan was already spiraling into paranoia now. They started investigating immediately after the party. I thought carefully for a moment. Then slowly, something occurred to me. Vanessa. His eyes lifted sharply. What her family? Ethan stared at me silently. Then realization hit him too. Vanessa's father, the financial questions, the coldness afterward. Of course. The Harpers hadn't walked away emotionally. They walked away strategically. In their world, damaged reputations spread like disease. And Ethan had suddenly become risky. He looked physically sick now. She reported concerns, he whispered. I believed it instantly. Not because Vanessa hated him, because protecting status mattered more to people like her than loyalty ever would. The irony sat bitterly inside me. Ethan spent years trying to impress wealthy people who ultimately abandoned him the moment weakness appeared. And the mother he pushed away was still standing here, still listening, still hurting with him. That's not your fault, I said quietly. He laughed once. It kind of is. Then his voice cracked again. I built my whole life around people who disappear the second things get ugly. I looked at him carefully. Yes. The honesty surprised him. Then I added softly, but you also pushed away the people who would have stayed. Tears filled his eyes again immediately, because he knew exactly who I meant. He looked down at Robert's letter, still clutched tightly in his hands. She gave the ring back, he whispered suddenly. What, Vanessa? My chest tightened painfully. When this morning. I stayed silent. She left it with the doorman. His voice sounded hollow now. No anger, no arrogance, just emptiness. I thought she loved me. The sentence hurt in a different way, because beneath all Ethan's mistakes, he truly had wanted to be loved. The problem was he searched for love in rooms built on performance instead of truth. And eventually, performance always collapses. I walked slowly toward the coffee maker near the back counter. You should eat something, I said gently. I'm not hungry. You haven't slept either. He laughed bitterly. How can you tell? Because I raised you. That almost broke him again. He looked around the tailoring shop one more time before whispering, I don't know who I am without all of it. I poured 2 cups of coffee quietly before answering. That's because you built your identity around being impressive. Then I handed him 1 cup carefully. But impressive and valuable are not the same thing. Ethan stared down at the coffee silently. And for the first time since he walked into my shop, my son no longer looked like a man trying to protect his image. He looked like someone standing in the ruins of it. By the end of that week, Ethan lost almost everything he thought defined him. The suspension from his firm became indefinite. Then came the apartment notice. Then the car. Then the phone calls stopped. Not completely, but enough. Enough for him to finally understand how conditional his world had always been. People who once fought for reservations beside him suddenly became too busy to answer texts. Friends who used to post champagne photos with him online disappeared quietly into silence. One man Ethan had called his closest business partner sent a 3-line message that ended with, probably best we create some professional distance for now. Professional distance. Funny phrase. It means you're sinking, and I don't want people seeing me near you. I watched all of this happen slowly from across the tailoring shop over the next several days, because Ethan never went back to Chicago. At first, he claimed it was temporary, just until things settled down. But deep down, we both knew the truth. Chicago no longer felt like home to him, not after the illusion cracked. The first night he stayed in Dayton, he booked a hotel downtown. By the 3rd night, he walked into the tailoring shop looking exhausted and said quietly, They canceled my corporate apartment access. I nodded once. And the hotel, too expensive. I stayed silent, not cruelly, just waiting. Finally, after several painful seconds, Ethan muttered, Can I stay upstairs for a little while? That sentence alone carried enough humiliation to nearly break my heart. Because this man once looked embarrassed to be connected to my small life. Now he was asking shelter from it. Of course, I said softly. His eyes closed briefly with relief. That hurt too. Not because I minded helping him. Because he looked genuinely surprised I still would. The apartment above the shop hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same faded wallpaper. Same old couch. Same tiny kitchen with the squeaky cabinet door Robert never got around to fixing. Ethan stood in the living room the first night, looking around quietly. I forgot how small this place is, he murmured. I smiled faintly while setting blankets on the sofa. No, I said gently. You just got used to bigger things. He didn't answer. That became common between us. Long silences, heavy silences, the kind built from years of emotional distance slowly trying to collapse. A few days later, Ethan received official notice that his engagement to Vanessa was over. Not through a conversation, not even a phone call, through lawyers. I found him sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at the papers for nearly an hour. "She really hired attorneys," he whispered eventually. I placed a plate of toast beside him quietly. "She comes from a family that protects assets first." His laugh sounded hollow. "I thought I was family." I sat across from him slowly. "No," I said softly. "You are potential." That sentence lingered heavily between us. Ethan looked older now, not physically, spiritually, like disappointment had finally stripped away the polished armor he'd worn for years. "What's wrong with me?" he asked suddenly. The vulnerability in his voice startled me. I looked at my son carefully. The same little boy who once cried because a stray dog got hit by a truck. The same teenager who worked summers helping elderly neighbors mow lawns for extra money. He wasn't born cruel. Life had simply taught him the wrong things mattered most. "There's nothing wrong with wanting success," I said quietly. "Then why do I feel disgusting?" Because for the first time, he could finally see himself clearly. I reached for my coffee slowly. "You spent too long believing being admired was the same thing as being loved." His eyes filled immediately. Maybe I deserved this. The words hurt me more than I expected. No mother wants her child destroyed, but maybe I needed to be. I didn't answer, because part of me feared he was right. Pain changes people. Sometimes gently, sometimes violently, but almost always honestly. 3 days later, Ethan received another call from Chicago. I could tell it was bad immediately from his face. "What happened?" I asked after he hung up. He stared blankly toward the shop window. "They terminated my position." Silence. Then finally, officially. I inhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, and I meant it, despite everything. Because watching your child lose their future hurts even when they helped cause it." Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "I don't even know how to explain this to people. Maybe stop trying to explain things through appearances." That landed quietly. Then he laughed bitterly. "You really don't miss an opportunity to teach lessons now, huh?" I looked at him carefully. "No," I whispered. "I think life's teaching them now. I'm just standing nearby." That evening, Ethan sat alone in the tailoring shop long after closing. He watched me work silently for almost an hour while I repaired a winter coat for an elderly customer. Finally, he spoke. "How many years did you do this?" I glanced up. "What work like this?" I smiled faintly. "Most of my life." His eyes followed my hands carefully while I sewed. "They look painful." I looked down at my fingers. Crooked knuckles, tiny scars. Dry skin from decades of fabric chemicals and winter cold. "These hands built your life," I said softly before I could stop myself. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Good. He needed to hear that. A few minutes later, he whispered, "I don't know how to fix what I became." My chest tightened painfully. Because there it was. Not denial. Not arrogance. Awareness. And awareness is where real change begins. I tied off the thread carefully before answering. "You stop asking how to get your old life back." He looked up slowly, and then, "You build a better one." His eyes looked lost. How I stood slowly from the sewing machine, then walked toward the back storage room. When I returned, I placed an old folded apron on the counter in front of him. Ethan frowned. "What's this, your new beginning?" Confusion crossed his face. I leaned lightly against the counter. If you're staying here, you work. His expression shifted instantly. You want me to work in the shop? Yes. Mom? No. My voice stayed calm, firm. No expensive shortcuts. No financial rescue plans. No hidden accounts. No friends from Chicago fixing things. He stared at me silently, then laughed once in disbelief. You're serious? Very. I worked at one of the top investment firms in the country. And now you'll learn how to hem pants. His pride flinched visibly. Good. Pride needed breaking before character could grow back. I'm not qualified for this, he muttered. I almost smiled. Neither was I when your father died. That silenced him immediately. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Dayton, while the tailoring shop glowed warm beneath old yellow lights. Ethan stared down at the apron for a very long time. Then finally, quietly, almost painfully, he asked, what exactly would I have to do? And deep inside my chest, for the first time in months, a tiny spark of hope appeared. Ethan's first week working in the tailoring shop was almost painful to watch. Not because he refused to help, because he genuinely didn't know how. The man who once managed investment portfolios worth millions stood frozen one Monday morning staring at a mop bucket like it contained advanced mathematics. You fill it with water first, I said calmly from behind the counter. He looked up mildly offended. I know how a mop works. Wonderful. Then today will go smoothly. He muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, this is humiliating. I pretended not to hear. Truthfully, part of me understood his struggle. Not the pride, the identity collapse. When someone builds their entire sense of worth around status, losing it feels like becoming invisible. And Ethan had spent most of his adult life being admired. Now, he was sweeping thread off old wooden floors, while little old church ladies asked him to carry garment bags to their cars. Life humbles people in strange ways. By the third day, he stopped wearing designer shoes to work. That made me strangely emotional. Not because of the shoes themselves, because it was the first visible sign he was beginning to let go of performance. Still, the transition wasn't graceful. One afternoon, Mrs. Delgado came in needing alterations for her grandson's funeral suit. Ethan accidentally pinned the pant leg unevenly and nearly stabbed his own thumb in the process. Mrs. Delgado chuckled kindly. You're new at this, huh? Ethan forced a tight smile. Very. I watched quietly from my sewing machine while he redid the measurements. Years ago, Ethan would have considered tasks like this beneath him. Now he was learning something important. There is dignity in work people overlook. That lesson changes a person slowly, but deeply. A few days later, I sent him on deliveries across town. At first, he looked horrified. You want me to drive clothes around? I want you to help. He sighed heavily, but took the garment bags anyway. When he returned 3 hours later, something about him seemed quieter. Different. How'd it go? I asked casually. He leaned against the counter. Mrs. Parker tried paying me with homemade pie. I smiled faintly. That means she likes you. He shook his head slowly. She knew my name. Most people around here do. That's weird. No, I said softly. That's community. Chicago had taught Ethan networking. Dayton was teaching him connection. There's a difference. One rainy Thursday afternoon, a teenage girl came into the shop holding a faded prom dress. She looked nervous enough to cry. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know this is stupid. It's not stupid, I said gently. The girl explained quietly that her mother lost her job and they couldn't afford major alterations, but she desperately wanted to wear her late grandmother's dress to prom. I could feel Ethan listening from the back room. I measured the dress carefully while the girl stood trembling with embarrassment. Finally, I smiled. "We'll make it beautiful." Her eyes widened immediately. "How much will it cost?" I glanced briefly toward Ethan, then answered the way I always had. "We'll figure it out." After she left, Ethan stared at me. "You're not charging her properly. She can't afford properly." He frowned slightly. "But you already struggle financially." I smiled sadly. "Not everything valuable returns money." He looked at the door the girl had exited through. "She reminded me of you," he admitted quietly. "How she looked ashamed for needing help." The fact that he noticed that nearly made me cry. Because old Ethan wouldn't have seen it. Not really. That evening, Ethan stayed late helping organize fabric inventory in the back room. Rain tapped softly against the windows while old jazz music played from Robert's ancient radio near the register. For the first time in weeks, the shop felt peaceful. Then the bell above the door rang unexpectedly. An older black man in an expensive wool coat stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. The moment I saw him, I smiled. Well, look who finally remembered poor people exist. The man laughed warmly. Camila Boyd still throwing punches at the door. Ethan looked confused. The man stepped forward and hugged me tightly. "How are you, Leon, better than I deserve?" Then he noticed Ethan standing nearby. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "This your boy?" I nodded. "Leon Foster, meet Ethan." Leon extended his hand immediately. "Pleasure." Ethan shook it politely, but I noticed something instantly. Leon carried himself differently from the wealthy men Ethan used to admire. No performance, no arrogance, just quiet confidence. "You own Foster Logistics?" Ethan asked suddenly. Leon laughed. "Guilty." Ethan blinked in surprise. Even I had forgotten how recognizable Leon's company had become over the years. "You built that company?" Ethan asked. Leon smiled softly. "Not alone." Then his eyes moved toward me. "Your mama played a part in that too." Ethan looked confused again. "What do you mean?" Leon leaned lightly against the counter. 25 years ago, I walked into this shop with one suit and $14 in my bank account. I remembered it instantly. Young father, recently divorced, trying desperately to look respectable for business meetings. I had a job interview, Leon continued, and the lining in my only suit jacket was falling apart. Ethan listened silently. "I told your mama I couldn't afford proper repairs." Leon smiled at me warmly. "You know what she did?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "She fixed the suit anyway. Refused payment." I shrugged lightly. "You looked like you needed a chance." Leon laughed softly. "I did." His expression grew gentler. 3 years later, when my trucking company finally turned profitable, I came back trying to repay her. Ethan glanced toward me. "You know what she said?" I closed my eyes briefly, already remembering. Leon smiled. "She said, 'Then help someone else when it's your turn.'" Silence settled quietly across the shop. Leon looked directly at Ethan now. "Your mother builds people before she builds clothes." The words hit harder than anything else that week. I saw it happen instantly in Ethan's face. Because for years, he measured value through status, money, luxury, influence. But standing in front of him was a successful businessman who respected his mother not because she was wealthy, but because she had once shown kindness when nobody else did. "That suit got me my first real contract," Leon continued softly. "Changed my whole life." Ethan looked down slowly. "I didn't know." "No," Leon said gently. "You probably didn't know a lot about your mama." That wasn't cruel. Just true. After Leon left, The tailoring shop fell quiet again. Ethan stood motionless near the counter for several long seconds. Then finally, he whispered, "People love you." The sadness in his voice nearly broke me. I smiled faintly. I've lived long enough to learn something important. What most people don't remember what you wore. I looked directly at him. They remember how you made them feel. His eyes filled immediately, because suddenly he understood something painful. All those years spent chasing admiration, and the person most respected in his life was the woman wearing an old brown coat. Not because she looked important, because she loved people well. Ethan sat slowly in the chair beside my sewing machine. Then, after a long silence, he whispered something I had waited years to hear. "I think I became the kind of man Dad warned me about." Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. But I stayed calm, because healing isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just one honest sentence spoken at the right moment. Spring arrived slowly in Dayton. The snow melted first, then the gray skies softened, and little by little life inside the tailoring shop began feeling lighter too. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but softer. Ethan changed in ways that didn't happen all at once. That's the truth people rarely talk about. Real growth is usually quiet. It looks like a man waking up early without complaining. Like someone carrying heavy garment bags before being asked. Like remembering customers' names. Like apologizing without expecting immediate forgiveness. Over the next 2 months, Ethan worked beside me every day. No shortcuts. No secret interviews in Chicago. No hidden attempts to reclaim his old life. At first, people in town whispered when they saw him sweeping sidewalks outside Boyd Alterations and Tailoring. Some recognized him from online business articles before everything collapsed. Others simply remembered the boy who left Ohio, determined never to come back. But slowly, the whispers changed, because Ethan stopped acting like he was above the work. One afternoon, I watched him kneeling on the floor, helping an elderly veteran button his coat after arthritis made the man's hands shake too badly. Another day, he spent nearly an hour delivering repaired school uniforms to a single mother whose car had broken down. No cameras, no audience, just kindness. And somehow, that mattered more to me than any financial success he'd ever achieved. Then, one Thursday evening, Ethan surprised me. "I rented the community hall for Saturday," he said while sorting invoices near the register. I looked up from my sewing machine. "For what fundraiser?" I blinked in confusion. "What kind of fundraiser?" He hesitated slightly. "For the shop." I stared at him. "The roof still leaks during heavy rain," he continued quietly. "And the front sign is falling apart." Emotion caught painfully in my throat. "You don't have money for that." "I know." "Then why would you rent a hall?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "Because apparently Dayton people pay each other in pies and loyalty." I laughed before I could stop myself. It was the first real laugh I'd had in months. Ethan smiled softly at the sound. I asked Leon for help, he admitted, and Mrs. Parker already volunteered to organize food. My chest tightened. Because this was new. The old Ethan would have been too proud to ask for help. Too image-conscious to organize a community fundraiser in a small town hall. But this Ethan was learning humility. And humility changes a person beautifully when they allow it to. Saturday evening arrived warmer than expected. The community hall filled slowly with familiar faces from around Dayton. Teachers, retired factory workers, church members, single mothers, old customers. Even Martha Collins drove in from Chicago after hearing about the event through Leon. Nobody wore designer gowns. Nobody arrived in black luxury cars. And somehow, the room felt richer than the engagement party ever had. There was laughter here too, but warm laughter. Safe laughter. The kind built from people who actually know each other. I stood near the refreshment table, feeling overwhelmed, while volunteers arranged homemade casseroles and folding chairs around the hall. "You okay?" Ethan asked quietly beside me. I nodded slowly. I didn't expect this many people. He looked around the room. "They came for you." Emotion rose sharply in my chest again. "No," I whispered. "They came for us." I saw his eyes flicker slightly at that word. Us. The fundraiser itself was simple, a silent auction, small donations, community music. Leon even convinced a local jazz trio to perform for free. At one point, I stepped outside briefly for air. The sunset painted soft orange light across downtown Dayton, while spring wind carried distant laughter through the open hall doors behind me. Then I heard footsteps approaching. Ethan. He stood beside me quietly for several seconds before speaking. "I used to think successful people looked important," he admitted softly. I smiled faintly. "And now?" He glanced back toward the hall. "Now I think important people make others feel seen." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes, because somewhere along the way, my son had finally started becoming the man Robert hoped he would be. Not wealthy, not admired. Good. That mattered more. A few minutes later, Leon tapped a spoon against a glass inside the hall. "All right, everybody," he called warmly. "Before dessert disappears completely, Ethan's got something he wants to say." My stomach tightened immediately. I turned toward Ethan. "You don't have to?" "Yes," he interrupted softly. "I do." The room quieted as he walked slowly toward the front. I watched people smile encouragingly at him, not because he was impressive, because they could see he was trying. That difference mattered deeply. Ethan stood behind the small microphone near the stage, looking nervous. Really nervous. His hands shook slightly. For one strange moment, he reminded me of the little boy preparing for his first school speech years ago. He cleared his throat once, then looked directly at me. "I spent a long time being ashamed of where I came from," he said quietly. The room went still instantly. I felt my chest tighten. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "A few months ago, I humiliated my mother publicly because I thought old clothes made someone look unimportant." Pain flickered across his face now. "But the truth is," his voice cracked slightly, "I was the one who looked small." Silence. Deep silence. The kind built from honesty. Ethan looked around the room slowly. My mother spent her whole life helping people without asking for recognition. And somehow, I became so obsessed with being admired that I stopped seeing her clearly. Tears filled my eyes completely now. Several people nearby were crying too, including Martha. Ethan's breathing shook slightly before he spoke again. "I hurt the person who loved me most." The words landed like broken glass inside my chest. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Then finally, my son looked directly at me and said the words I had waited years to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom." Not defensive, not rushed, not forced. Real. The room stayed completely silent afterward. I could see fear in Ethan's eyes now. Not fear of losing status. Fear that I might never fully forgive him. Slowly I stood from my chair, then walked toward the stage. Every step felt heavy with memory. The sacrifices, the hurt, the humiliation, the grief. But also the love that somehow survived all of it. When I reached him, Ethan looked seconds away from breaking apart completely. Then I noticed something hanging over the back of a nearby chair. Robert's brown coat. The same coat Ethan once mocked publicly. I picked it up slowly. The room remained silent. Then carefully, gently, I draped the coat over my son's shoulders. Ethan's face collapsed instantly. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks. "He'd be proud of you right now," I whispered. That destroyed him completely. He wrapped both arms around me and cried like he hadn't allowed himself to cry in years. And standing there inside that small community hall, my son finally looked richer than he ever had wearing designer suits. 6 months later, the sign outside Boyd Alterations and Tailoring finally got replaced. Not with anything flashy, just clean white lettering on polished dark wood. Simple, honest, strong. Ethan installed it himself on a cool September morning while I stood below holding the ladder steady. Little to the left, I called upward, "This good still crooked." He laughed softly. "You've been saying that to me my entire life." I smiled despite myself. Maybe I had. But for the first time in years, crooked no longer meant broken. It meant unfinished, and unfinished things still have hope. Downtown Dayton looked different in autumn. The trees along Main Street glowed gold and orange, while cool wind carried the smell of coffee and fallen leaves through the sidewalks. Life inside the shop had changed too, not dramatically, quietly. Ethan still worked there every day. At first he insisted it was temporary until he figured things out. But slowly, something surprising happened. He stopped speaking about Dayton like it was a punishment. He started belonging here again, not because his old ambitions disappeared, because his definition of success changed. Some mornings I'd walk downstairs before opening and find him already making coffee for customers. Other days, he'd spend hours helping elderly clients carry garment bags to their cars without being asked. The most surprising part? People genuinely liked him now. Not the polished version from Chicago. This version, the honest one. One Friday afternoon, Mrs. Delgado whispered to me while Ethan helped him school uniforms in the back room, "Your son has your father's eyes now." At first, I didn't understand. Then I realized she meant Robert, and suddenly my throat tightened so badly I couldn't answer. Because she was right. Not physically, spiritually. The hardness inside Ethan had softened, and somehow, grief and humility had carved him back into someone recognizable again. That didn't mean everything magically healed. Some scars remained. Chicago never fully welcomed him back after the financial scandal. A few smaller firms reached out quietly over the months, but Ethan surprised me by turning most of them down. One evening, while closing the shop, I finally asked him why. He folded shirts carefully before answering. "Because I don't trust the person I become when image matters more than people." I stared at him quietly. That sentence alone told me how much he'd changed. Not perfect, but real. A few weeks later, Leon Foster invited us to a local business leadership dinner in Columbus. At first, Ethan refused immediately. "I'm not really comfortable at events anymore." I understood that too. Public humiliation leaves shadows inside people long after the moment ends. But Leon insisted. Good people shouldn't hide forever. So eventually, Ethan agreed. The event took place at a renovated historic hotel downtown. Nothing as extravagant as the engagement party in Chicago, but elegant enough to stir old memories. I noticed Ethan standing silently in front of the mirror before we left that evening. Not nervous exactly, just thoughtful. What I asked, gently. He looked down at his suit. It was charcoal gray. Well-fitted. Simple. The same suit he'd worn years earlier, during one of his first major finance interviews. But now it looked different, because Ethan had changed inside it. "I was thinking," he said quietly, adjusting the sleeve, "this used to be my favorite suit." I smiled faintly. You love that thing. He nodded. Back then I thought expensive clothes made me important. Then he glanced toward me. But this isn't actually the best suit I've ever owned. Emotion caught instantly in my chest. Because I already knew what he meant. A few months earlier, after the fundraiser, Ethan had found one of Robert's older suits stored in the apartment closet upstairs. Worn fabric, outdated style, small tear near the inside lining. He brought it downstairs carefully and asked, "Can we fix it?" Together, we spent 3 evenings repairing it. New stitching, adjusted sleeves, fresh lining, nothing fancy, just care. And now, that old repaired suit had become Ethan's favorite thing in his closet. Not because it looked expensive, because it carried memory, love, humility, home. At the business dinner that evening, several people recognized Ethan from his former career in Chicago. I saw the tension return briefly to his shoulders when whispers started. But then something beautiful happened. Instead of pretending not to know me, my son walked directly toward me in front of everyone. He smiled warmly and placed his hand gently against my shoulder. "This is my mother," he said proudly. "Camila Boyd. No hesitation, no embarrassment, no apology hidden beneath the introduction. Just pride, simple pride. And somehow, that healed something deep inside me that words never could." Throughout the evening, people kept approaching Ethan. Some asked about Chicago carefully. Others asked about his transition back to Dayton. And every single time, Ethan answered honestly. No performance, no fake image, no polished lies. At one point, a young businessman asked him quietly, "Do you ever regret losing everything?" Ethan thought about that question for a long time before answering. Then finally, he smiled faintly and said, "I regret becoming someone who needed everything to feel valuable." I nearly cried right there beside the dinner table. Because growth sounds like that. Not dramatic speeches, not perfect redemption, just painful honesty spoken calmly. Later that night, after the event ended, Ethan and I walked slowly through downtown Columbus beneath soft streetlights. Cool autumn wind moved gently through the trees. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then finally, Ethan stopped walking. What I asked softly. He looked emotional suddenly. "I never really thanked you." My chest tightened instantly. "You don't have to." "Yes," he interrupted gently. "I do." Tears filled his eyes. For everything. The words came out rough. Not just the money, not the sacrifices. He swallowed hard. For refusing to give up on me even after I became someone ugly. I looked at my son standing there in Robert's repaired suit beneath the glow of quiet streetlights. And suddenly, I realized something important. Parents spend years believing love means protecting children from falling. But sometimes, real love means letting them fall hard enough to finally see themselves clearly. "I never stopped loving you," I whispered. His face broke apart emotionally then. "I know. And this time, when he hugged me, it didn't feel like guilt. It felt like home." As we continued walking, Ethan glanced down at the old repaired suit jacket and smiled softly. "You know something funny? What this is the cheapest suit I own." I laughed quietly. "But it's the best one." He nodded slowly. Because finally, after years spent chasing expensive things, my son had learned the value of what cannot be bought. The older I get, the more I realize life has a strange way of revealing what truly matters. When we're young, we think success is something people can see from the outside: the right clothes, the right car, the right address, the right people standing beside us. But time has taught me that appearances are fragile things. They disappear the moment life becomes difficult. Character is what remains. I spent years believing my job as a mother was to protect my son from pain. I worked myself to exhaustion, trying to make sure Ethan never felt the fear, shame, and insecurity that followed our family after my husband died. But somewhere along the way, I learned a painful truth. When we protect people from every consequence, we may also protect them from growth. Real love is not blind rescue. Real love tells the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. My son lost money, status, relationships, and the image he spent years building. But in losing those things, he finally found something more valuable: humility, gratitude, kindness, and the courage to see people for who they are instead of what they own. And maybe that's the lesson I hope stays with anyone listening to my story tonight. Never be ashamed of the people who sacrificed quietly to help you stand taller in life. One day, the designer clothes fade. The applause fades. The status fades. But the people who loved you when you had nothing, those people are priceless. So if someone in your life has loved you quietly, call them. Thank them. Sit beside them while you still can. Because one day you may realize the greatest riches you ever had were never hanging in your closet at all. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where life humbled you or changed the way you see family? And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Reading your messages makes me feel less alone in this big world. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy emotional family stories like this. And thank you for spending your time with me tonight.